Imagine standing on your porch, watching 139 cabins sink beneath rising water. Not because of a storm, but because one man turned a wheel. The HOA thought my lake was theirs. Their prized jewel, but they forgot one thing. I control the water. This is how nature answered arrogance. My name isn't important, but what you need to know is this. I've lived on this land my entire life. The kind of life where you don't just see nature, you know it. You breathe it. And when people think they can take it, they discover just how wrong they are. My family's story with this place goes back 5 generations. It wasn't born out of wealth or polished estates or a vision of turning dirt into dollars. No, it started with sweat, stone, and sheer grit. My great-great-grandfather, Angus Mount, was a civil engineer in the early 1900s. While most people looked at these Appalachian hills and saw rocky, worthless land, Angus saw water. And water meant power. In the 1920s, Angus did something most people thought was impossible. With his own hands, his own money, and the help of a few loyal workers, he built a dam. Not some colossal monument like Hoover or Glen Canyon, but a stone masterpiece carved from the land itself. He stacked boulders, poured sweat, and built it to last. And when he was done, the valley filled. What had been a muddy gorge became a sprawling 700-acre lake. My Lake Angus didn't just build a dam. He built a legacy. He built a refuge. He built something meant to endure, something that could tame floods, harness streams, and bring beauty to a land nobody else wanted. At the highest ridge, he built a lodge of timber and stone strong enough to withstand storms, humble enough to belong to the wilderness. That lodge is where I live today. The lake he created wasn't just water behind a wall. It was alive. It reflected the sky, mirrored the trees, and carried the voices of loons at night. It gave my family purpose. For nearly a century, we were not landlords, not exploiters. We were custodians. Quiet guardians of something bigger than ourselves. Through decades of storms and droughts, my family kept the dam strong. We patched stone, oiled gears, greased fittings, and monitored water levels. My father taught me the numbers carved into the original blueprints, the flow rates, the stress tolerances, the exact height of the natural floodplain, knowledge passed down not in classrooms, but in calloused hands in midnight lessons in the pump house. The papers, our deeds, our rights were ironclad. Not just the soil, but the water itself was ours. That's the part people never seem to understand. They think land is dirt, something you can fence off and build over. But water? Water doesn't listen to fences. It follows gravity, it obeys topography, and it answers only to whoever controls the dam. In this case, me, and for decades, that was enough. The world left us alone, and we left the world alone. I paid my taxes, kept the dam safe, and lived quietly. No noise, no drama, just the sound of the lake lapping against the shore. But then came change. It always does, doesn't it? A developer bought the neighboring land my family had sold decades earlier to pay off estate taxes. He saw opportunity where others had seen wilderness. Within a few years, he carved up the hillsides into parcels for the wealthy. A new community sprouted up. Lakeview Pinnacle Estates? At first I didn't mind. People have the right to live where they want. I figured we could be neighbors, the quiet man on the hill and the new money crowd down below. But the thing about people is, some of them aren't content with their share. Some of them look at what you've built, what you've protected, and decide it belongs to them. They see a lake and call it a community. Feature, they see history and call it an amenity. And that's where the trouble began. Because while my great-great-grandfather built this lake with stone and sweat, the people moving in saw it as theirs by entitlement, and their queen, a woman named Brenda. Her real name was Brenda McLaughlin, but if ever there was someone who embodied the spirit of a Karen, it was her. She arrived in Lakeview Pinnacle Estates like royalty taking possession of a throne. White Escalade, designer sunglasses, and that brittle smile that never reached her eyes. Brenda wasn't just another resident. She was the inaugural president of the HOA, and she treated that title not as a responsibility, but as a crown. Where most people just wanted a peaceful home, she wanted power. She wanted rules. She wanted control. From the moment she laid eyes on my lake, she saw it as hers. To her, it wasn't a piece of history or the hard work of my ancestors. It was branding. It was a marketing tool, a jewel to hang on the crown of Lakeview Pinnacle Estates. She saw Lakeview in the name and believed it meant ownership. Her first moves were subtle. Newsletters filled with cheerful commands. We remind all residents to enjoy the beautiful community lake responsibly, as if she were granting them permission to exist beside what was mine. Then came the emails, personal this time. The HOA has noticed your dock does not conform to approved aesthetic guidelines. Please see the attached palette for acceptable color schemes. I almost laughed the first time I read one. Almost. My reply was polite but firm. The HOA's jurisdiction ended at their property line. My dock? My business? End of story. That should have been enough. A reasonable person would have let it go. But Brenda was not reasonable. My refusal wasn't just an answer, it was an insult. And Brenda was the kind of woman who could not tolerate being defied. She began to circle me like a hawk. At the grocery store, I'd catch her whispering about that scruffy man on the hill. At HOA meetings, she spoke of community harmony while glaring in my direction. It was never about the dock. It was about authority, hers, and my refusal to bend to it. The more she postured, the clearer it became. Brenda wasn't satisfied with managing pool hours and lawn regulations. She wanted dominion. And in her mind, the lake was the crown jewel of her dominion. My lake. Neighbors fell under her spell. She had a way of convincing people that she was protecting their investment, fighting for property values, standing strong against the outsider who wasn't playing by the rules. In truth, she was planting seeds of control, watered with ego and entitlement, and I could feel it. Something bigger was coming. This wasn't just about a dock or a line on a map. Brenda wanted more. She looked at me and saw a man standing in the way of her empire. And I looked at her and saw a storm brewing on the horizon. It started with a fence. Not mine, theirs. I had the entire 2,000-acre parcel surveyed. Every boundary marked with iron pins and bright orange flags. Clear, precise, unarguable. Good fences make good neighbors, as the saying goes. But Brenda, she believed good neighbors were the ones who surrendered land for her convenience. The next HOA newsletter arrived, glossy and cheerful as always. But inside, my blood boiled. There it was, a beautifully rendered map of a brand new community recreation area. At Sandy Beach, volleyball court, kayak launch, fishing pier. It was an idyllic lakeside paradise. There was just one problem. Every inch of it was on my land. I thought it was a mistake at first, a misunderstanding. So I did what any rational person would do. I sent a cease and desist letter through my lawyer. A calm, formal warning. Property lines were clear, deeds were clear, and any construction would be trespassing. Her response? A smirk in legal form. She claimed there was a survey discrepancy and that the HOA had their own. More recent plat map? That was the first time I heard of it. Their survey. Curiosity turned quickly to alarm. I drove down to the county records office, pulled the file myself, and what I saw made my stomach drop. There it was, a freshly filed survey map for Lakeview Pinnacle Estates. And it was a fraud. The boundary line had been shifted subtly, deliberately. A few hundred feet jogged outward, all along the lake's edge. On paper, it swallowed up about 50 acres of my shoreline, including the very cove Brenda had marked for her grand recreation area. The forgery was slick. Official seals, signatures. At first glance, it looked legitimate. But I knew better. My family's deeds went back nearly a century. The truth was in black and white. I didn't stop there. I dug deeper. Days turned into nights as I combed through files, pulled deeds from the 1920s, reviewed the 1970s sale documents, and compared them to my recent GPS-verified survey. I even reshot the boundary myself using a high-precision rover. The data was irrefutable. And then I found the kicker. The surveyor listed on their map? He'd lost his license 2 years earlier. Not suspended, revoked. For falsifying documents in a zoning case, he was legally barred from submitting any plans. That was my smoking gun. Proof of fraud. I gathered everything into a neat, damning report. Deeds, maps, survey data, the license revocation. Bulletproof evidence. I sent it to Brenda and every member of the HOA board courtesy of my lawyer. I expected silence, maybe even shame. Surely the jig was up. But if there's one thing I should have known by then, it's this. Brenda's ego was bulletproof too. At the next HOA meeting, I sat in the back, listening. Brenda stood at the podium, holding up my report as if it were nothing more than a grocery flyer. This, she declared, is a harassment campaign by a disgruntled local. She waved the fraudulent map like it was the 10 Commandments. This is our community. This is our lake. We will not be bullied. The room applauded. Dutiful, obedient, desperate to believe her. The board nodded, drunk on her authority. And then they voted unanimously to proceed with construction. The bulldozers arrived Monday morning from my porch. I watched them tear into my land. Trees that had stood for a century came crashing down, earth ripped apart by steel. Dust clouds rose as if the land itself were groaning. I called the sheriff. He came, listened, looked at both maps, and shook his head. "This is a civil dispute," he said. "You'll have to take it to court." Exactly what Brenda wanted. Delay, confusion, years of legal battles while her project moved full speed ahead. She thought she'd won, but she had just made her biggest mistake yet. At first, it was just a volleyball court. A strip of sand dumped on my shoreline, with cheap wooden posts hammered into the ground. Then came a kayak launch. A dock hammered into place by workers who never once glanced at the survey flags, marking my boundary line, but that was only the beginning. When my injunction got buried in the court's endless docket, Brenda saw an opening. She didn't just build her little recreation area. No, she aimed higher. She unveiled Phase 2. Her crown jewel. The pinnacle cabins. 139 of them. These weren't fishing shacks. They were luxury vacation rentals. Prefab houses trucked in on 18-wheelers, dropped onto concrete slabs, wired with plumbing, electricity, HVAC, the works. Each one with a tiny deck facing my water. Each one a monument to arrogance. The construction was relentless. Every day, the rumble of trucks shook the ground as they rolled past the turnoff to my lodge. Bulldozers cut into the earth, backhoes swung like mechanical arms tearing at the shoreline, and workers hammered from dawn until dusk. Within weeks, the cabins began to sprout like a forest of boxers, identical, soulless, from my porch. I watched it all. Brenda made sure I did. She rode around the site in a golf cart, like some self-crowned queen, barking orders, pointing at blueprints, waving her manicured hands, as if she'd personally orchestrated the whole empire. Sometimes, she'd drive right up to the edge of the construction zone nearest my property. She'd stop. She'd look up at my lodge, and she'd smile, not a friendly smile. A smug, taunting one, it said. "See, I'm winning. What are you going to do about it?" Her arrogance burned, but I didn't move. Not yet. While she measured progress in cabins and rental brochures, I measured something older, quieter, and far more patient. History. Engineering. Water. I spent those days in my great-grandfather's study, poring over century-old blueprints, maps, and journals, and my nights in the dam's pump house, walking the dry gallery tunnels, inspecting gears, testing valves, listening to the groan of machinery built to last longer than Brenda's entire empire. Meanwhile, her project grew like a tumor. By midsummer, the shoreline looked more like a subdivision than a lake. The cabins sat shoulder to shoulder, jammed in tight, every square foot squeezed for maximum profit. They were supposed to be rustic getaways, but what I saw was a parody of wilderness. Plastic siding, fake chimneys, deck chairs bought in bulk, The workers hurried to finish them, each cabin popping up faster than the last. Brenda strutted from site to site, shaking hands with contractors, patting board members on the back, showing off her lake to potential investors, and the whole time, she ignored me. No worse. She dismissed me. In her eyes, I was already beaten. Some stubborn relic up on the hill, powerless against her momentum. She thought I couldn't stop her, that the courts would drown me in paperwork while her cabins drowned my shoreline in concrete. But she didn't know the truth. She didn't know every foundation they poured was sitting inside a floodplain my family had mapped 100 years ago. She didn't know every cabin rose inside a buffer zone designed not for houses, but for water. She thought she owned the lake, but the lake still answered to me, and when the time came, it would answer with a tide no legal loophole could hold back. The answers were buried in dust. I had spent countless hours in my great-grandfather's study, surrounded by the smell of old timber and paper that had yellowed with time. Angus Maloud had been meticulous an engineer, not just of stone, but of details. His shelves sagged under the weight of journals, ledgers, and blueprints rolled so tightly they crackled when I uncurled them. I thought I knew the dam. I'd grown up walking its walls, oiling its gears, turning its valves under my father's watchful eye. But what I found one night buried between ledgers from 1928 changed everything. It was his journal. A leather-bound volume, edges frayed, his handwriting still sharp and precise after nearly a century. And in its pages, I found the truth Brenda never could have imagined. Angus had designed the lake to sit at an elevation. That was the controlled level, maintained by the spillways for safety and recreation. But he also documented something more, something no one but Maloud ever fully understood: the true floodplain. The lake reaches its natural high water mark at 1,845 feet, he wrote. This buffer is necessary in case of generational floods. The structure can withstand it. The land can contain it. But anything built below this line will belong, in time, to the water. 7 feet. That was the difference between normal and natural. 7 vertical feet. A margin designed not for humans, but for gravity. I spread out the topographical maps, tracing contour lines with my finger. My lodge sat high on the ridge, well above the 1,850 line. My land was safe. But Brenda's cabins? Every last one of them squatted comfortably inside the danger zone. The lowest sat at 1,839 feet. The highest barely cleared 1,844. They weren't lakefront properties. They were temporary islands waiting to happen. I leaned back, staring at the maps, the calculations, the numbers that had been inked by my great-grandfather's hand. He hadn't just built a dam. He had built me a weapon, a silent, patient one, a truth written into the very bones of the valley. The cabins didn't belong to Brenda. They didn't belong to the HOA. They didn't even belong to me. They belonged to the water, and all it would take was a turn of 2 iron wheels to remind everyone of that fact. Still, I wasn't reckless. I knew if I acted blindly, Brenda would twist it into an act of vengeance. I needed to make it airtight, legally, technically, morally. So I documented everything. I flew drones over the site, photographing every cabin in relation to the 1,845 contour line. I marked maps, logged elevations, and compared them against Angus's notes. I set up time-lapse cameras on my porch, capturing the construction in real time. I gathered every scrap of evidence until the case was unshakable, and then I began my quiet visits to the dam. Each night, I walked the gallery tunnels beneath its stone bulk, flashlight in hand, boots echoing against damp concrete. I inspected the cast-iron wheel valves, greased gears stiff from decades of waiting, and listened to the creak of steel older than Brenda's entire empire. The dam was ready. The water was waiting. And for the first time, I realized so was I. When you plan to move mountains, or in my case, water, you don't do it without covering your bases. So I sat down with Sam, my lawyer. He was old school, sharp as a tack, with a way of raising his eyebrows whenever I floated an idea too wild for his liking. When I first told him what I intended, he nearly choked on his coffee. "You want to do what?" he asked. But when I laid everything out, the deeds, the riparian rights, the journal, the topographical surveys, his expression shifted from disbelief to something else. Something closer to admiration. "You know," he said finally, adjusting his glasses, "you just might pull this off." Together, we drafted the letter. A masterpiece of legal precision. It stated in plain terms that the HOA had built 139 structures inside the dam's designated flood easement. That as the dam's operator, I was obligated to conduct safety inspections requiring the water to return temporarily to its natural maximum, elevation of 1,845 feet, and then came the hammer. Clear, unambiguous warning. 48 hours to vacate the flood zone. 48 hours to remove property, secure belongings, and prepare for water. The letter was sent, certified mail, signature required, and sure enough, Brenda signed for it. I could almost picture her smirk as she opened the envelope, scanned the words, and tossed it aside. To her, it was nothing but another threat from the man on the hill. The next morning, I watched from my porch as delivery trucks pulled up to the cabins. Workers unloaded furniture, stacked boxes, and staged porches with rocking chairs. They weren't evacuating. They were moving in. The morning of the deadline was gray and quiet, the kind of silence that makes the air feel heavy. Mist clung to the surface of the lake, softening the horizon. As if nature itself was holding its breath, at 9 o'clock sharp, the exact moment that 48 hours expired, I got in my truck and drove down to the dam. In the cab beside me sat a thermos of coffee, a battered notebook filled with calculations, and a phone already loaded with numbers I would need to call. I wasn't reckless. Before I set foot inside the dam, I dialed the sheriff's office. Calm, polite, I informed the dispatcher that the operator of the Loch Malaud Dam would be conducting routine structural inspections, requiring a temporary return of the lake to its documented maximum elevation. She sounded confused, but she took down the note. Then I called Sam. "It's time." I said simply, "Godspeed." He replied. The dam's gallery tunnel swallowed me in cool stone and echoes. My flashlight beam slid across rusted ladders, concrete walls, and the massive cast iron wheel valves at the heart of it all. I'd greased them days before, felt their weight, prepared them for this moment. I placed both hands on the first wheel. The iron was cold, rough beneath my palms. For a second, I just stood there, breathing in the damp air, listening to the faint rumble of water pressing against the other side. Then I turned. The wheel resisted at first, stiff from decades of disuse, but with a groan that seemed to rise from the earth itself, it began to move. Slowly, steadily, I forced the mechanism into motion. The gears whined, echoing in the cavern. The massive sluice gate shifted, closing inch by inch, restricting the outflow. Water began to collect. I moved to the second wheel, repeating the process. My arms burned, sweat beaded on my forehead, but with each rotation, I felt a grim satisfaction. The lake was listening. Hours passed. I alternated between wheels, cranking steadily, methodically, following the exact sequence my great-grandfather had written down almost a century ago. This wasn't chaos. This wasn't sabotage. It was procedure. It was the dam doing exactly what it had been built to do. By noon, I climbed back to the surface and made my way to the ridge above my lodge. Binoculars in hand, I trained my eyes on the shoreline, and there it was, the first sign, where water had always stopped a safe 20 feet from the lowest cabins. It now lapped gently at their manicured grass lawns. At first glance, it was nothing more than a shimmer, a puddle. Harmless, but I knew better. The lake had started to rise. By 1 o'clock, the puddle had crept into yards. By 2, the first concrete foundations were damp, darkened by the advancing tide. Workers stood around in confusion, pointing, gesturing, laughing nervously. By 3, their laughter was gone. The water was no longer subtle, it was climbing, steady and undeniable. And I stood on the ridge, coffee in hand, watching the cabins brace for the lesson Brenda had forced me to teach. By late afternoon, the lake had claimed its first victims. The lowest cabins, those closest to the shore, were now islands. Their lawns had vanished beneath murky water. Porch steps disappeared, one by one, until the waves lapped at front doors. Inside, furniture floated, curtains dragged across the rising tide, and shiny appliances sparked before hissing into silence. It wasn't a flood in the way most people imagine. There was no roar, no crashing wall of water, just a steady, silent rise. A tide that refused to stop. Nature doesn't need to rage when patience will do the job. From my ridge, I watched panic ripple across the construction site. Workers dropped their tools, shouting into phones. Trucks revved and tore up the dirt roads, carrying nothing but terrified men who wanted no part of what was coming. And then, right on cue, Brenda arrived. Her white Escalade barreled up the gravel. Halting at the water's edge, she stepped out, heels sinking into sodden ground, hands on her hips, fury radiating like heat from asphalt. Even from my distance, I could read her body language, disbelief, anger, and something else - fear. She marched toward the nearest submerged cabin, yelling at anyone who would listen. I couldn't hear the words, but I didn't need to. Her gesture said enough. She thought this was some plumbing error, some temporary malfunction. She thought she could shout the water back into place, but the water didn't care. By 4 o'clock, cabins in the lowest row were halfway underwater. Porch lights flickered, shorted out, and died. Pallets of unused lumber floated past, bobbing like toys in a bathtub. Each hour that passed swallowed another row of Brenda's empire. Homeowners began to gather. Some came in golf carts, others on foot, their faces a mixture of shock and betrayal. They'd been promised luxury lakefront living. What they got was a nightmare, unfolding in slow motion, and then came the sirens. The sheriff's cruiser pulled up the gravel road. Out stepped the same deputy who'd once been caught between my survey and Brenda's fraudulent map. He took one look at the water climbing steadily up the cabins and shook his head. Brenda stormed toward him, pointing a trembling finger up at my ridge. Even without hearing her, I knew the words, "Arrest him. He's flooding us out. He's destroying everything." The deputy didn't move. He didn't slap on cuffs. Instead, he listened as I came down, calm as the rising lake. A folder of documents tucked under my arm. I handed him everything. The certified letter, the blueprints, the deed specifying riparian rights, and the section in the operational manual authorizing water level inspections. Every word, every detail, every proof was ironclad. And then I said the line I had been waiting for. "Deputy, as far as I can tell, those cabins are nothing more than debris illegally dumped in my flood easement. I gave them 48 hours to remove it. They chose not to." For a long moment, the deputy stared at me, then back at Brenda, screaming, flailing, her kingdom sinking behind her. And in that moment, the truth dawned on him. This wasn't a crime scene. This was justice. The flood didn't just drown cabins. It drowned illusions by the time the water leveled off near the natural high mark. Every single one of Brenda's 139 cabins had been touched. Some were submerged to their rooftops, others sat half-drowned, their siding warped and their interiors rotting in silence. The empire she had promised the HOA $1 million crown jewel was now a graveyard of soggy plywood and floating furniture. And then came the fallout. Insurance investigators arrived first. They walked the shoreline with clipboards, photographing mold-stained walls and waterlogged appliances. At first, homeowners held out hope surely their policies would cover it. But the reports came back brutal, denied. The cabins weren't damaged by an act of God. They had been illegally built in a documented flood easement. That made it negligence. Gross negligence. Investors pulled their money. The construction company walked away. Pinnacle Living, the developer that had sold the dream of luxury lakefront living, went into damage control, denying responsibility even as lawsuits began to fly. And Brenda, her downfall was spectacular. She was sued by her own homeowners, sued by investors, sued by the very people she had convinced to trust her. Her name was dragged through court filings and angry community meetings. The white Escalade that once rolled like a chariot through the gates of Lakeview Estates was seen parked outside, the bankruptcy attorney's office. The HOA itself began to crumble. With no funds, no insurance coverage, and no way to defend against the tidal wave of lawsuits, it went bankrupt within the year. Their once proud newsletters vanished. Their signs faded. The gates that promised exclusivity now guarded nothing but resentment and rot. Meanwhile, I kept my head down. I documented everything for the courts, showed the certified letters, the surveys, the journals, the law itself. My attorney filed for damages, and the judge didn't hesitate. The developer's parent company, caught red-handed in fraud and trespass, was ordered to pay significant restitution. Enough to cover cleanup. Enough to make the point, but money wasn't the real victory. The real victory was silence. For the first time in years, the shoreline was quiet. No bulldozers, no golf carts, no HOA meetings filled with arrogance and applause. Just the sound of water lapping against rock. The same sound my great-grandfather must have heard when he first watched the valley fill behind the dam. Brenda had tried to build an empire on stolen ground. She had underestimated history, underestimated patience, and most of all, underestimated the simple, unrelenting power of water, and the lake had answered. When the last lawsuit settled and the last insurance denial was stamped, all that remained were ruins. 139 cabins, gutted by water, rotting in silence. The HOA abandoned them. The developers wrote them off. No one claimed responsibility, but they sat on my land, my shoreline. My burden, so I did what my family had always done. I cared for it. I hired demolition crews, salvaged what I could, hauled out the debris. It took months. Some days it felt endless. But slowly, the scars began to heal. Then came the restoration. A landscape architect helped me replant the shoreline with native trees and grasses. We rebuilt the natural curves of the cove, letting the land breathe again. Within a year, saplings swayed where concrete slabs once stood. Within 2 birds nested in branches. And the shoreline looked as though it had never been touched. And through it all, I kept the water steady. At its rightful level, at peace, sometimes kayakers from the chastened, reorganized HOA paddle by and wave. Their voices are quieter now, respectful. They know the story. Everyone around here does. The tale of Brenda, the cabins. And the day the lake reminded everyone who truly controlled it. I never set out to be a villain or a hero. I only wanted to be left alone on the land my family built with sweat and stone. But Brenda's arrogance forced my hand, and when she ignored every warning, she learned a lesson I didn't have to teach, nature did, because in the end, some lines cannot be crossed, and some waters are not yours to claim.